You first heard the signal on a Tuesday. It was a strange echo from the dark between galaxies. Your star science experts listened to it for days. They called it a cosmic fluke, a background noise from the dawn of time. You logged the transmission and promptly forgot about it. The universe was full of mysteries. This was just one more sound in the deep. It was nothing to worry about. You had economies to manage and traffic to complain about. The signal was a whisper that traveled for 1,000,000 years. It spoke of things you could not comprehend. It was a warning from a long-dead civilization, a final, desperate message sent into the void. Their words were a map of their own destruction. Their science was a plea to anyone listening. It described an enemy that devoured stars, an enemy that consumed light and hope. You didn't know any of this, of course. Your computers saw a pattern they could not solve. Your best minds called it an anomaly. They wrote papers on its peculiar frequencies. They won awards for their thoughtful analysis. None of them saw it for what it was: a death notice delivered far too late. So you went about your lives. You built your cities. You dreamed your small dreams, safe in your quiet corner of space. You never once looked back toward that strange sound. You never considered that it might be moving closer. You were busy with very important things. The signal was just a ghost. And you were not afraid of ghosts. This was your first mistake. It would not be your last. The universe is not obligated to make sense to you. It is only obligated to exist. Then came the shadows. They did not announce their arrival with fire and thunder. They simply appeared. One moment the sky was clear blue. The next, it was filled with silent, dark mountains. Their ships hung over every capital city on the planet. They blocked out the sun without a sound. They were impossible structures of black metal and cold light. No energy readings, no engine signatures, just presence. You stared up from your streets and your windows. A collective gasp was heard around the world. Every camera pointed at the sky. Every screen showed the same impossible sight. A ship the size of a city, motionless and menacing. They were a geometric puzzle that hurt the eyes, perfect shapes that did not belong in nature. They felt less like machines and more like tombstones. Your defense systems were completely silent. They saw nothing to target. Your jets scrambled, brave but useless. They looked like tiny insects buzzing around a giant's boot. The invaders paid them no mind. It was a show of absolute, effortless dominance. They did not need to prove their power. Their very existence was proof enough. For 12 hours, they did nothing. They just floated there, a silent testament to your own fragility. The world held its breath. Panic was a low hum beneath the surface of everything. You waited for a sign, a word, a weapon. You waited for them to do something. The silence was the worst part. It was a quiet that promised a terrible noise was coming. After a full day of silence, one message was sent. It was not a conversation. It was a command. The message appeared on every screen, in every language, on every device connected to your global network. The text was simple. The letters were stark white against a black background. It was a message of pure, undiluted arrogance. It read, "Your world belongs to the Cathar Imperium." The name itself sounded like breaking rock. You will submit. You will serve. Your resources are now ours. Your lives are now ours. Your future is now ours. There was no room for negotiation, no offer of terms. It was the declaration of a new owner, the kind you give to livestock. The message ended with an ultimatum. You have one solar cycle to accept your new reality. Defiance will be met with erasure. Choose wisely. And that was it. The screens returned to normal, but the dark ships remained, a constant, suffocating reminder of the choice you had to make. To bend the knee, or to be broken completely. Some argued for submission. They said life under a new master was better than no life at all. They talked about survival, about preserving what little you could. But they were a quiet minority. Fear can make people cautious, but it can also make them brave. Pride, it turns out, is a hard thing to kill. Even when facing extinction, your world's leaders met in a single, frantic broadcast. They came from every nation. Old enemies stood side by side. They looked at the silent ships above them. They looked at the faces of their people. They saw the same fire in every eye, a burning, desperate defiance. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an answer that came from deep within your soul. The refusal was sent without ceremony, a simple, unified no. It was broadcast on all channels. A single word against an empire that eats stars. Your small fleet of warships took to the skies. They were the best you had. Gleaming ships armed with missiles and lasers. They were the pride of your species. And they were hopelessly, tragically outmatched. The commanders knew it was a suicide mission. Every pilot knew they were flying to their death. But they went anyway. Not to win a war. You knew you could not win. They went to show that you would not be conquered easily. They went to show that humanity does not break. They went to write one last, fiery chapter in their history. You watched them ascend, a thin line of light against the looming dark. It was the bravest thing you had ever seen. A final act of courage in a world about to end. You knew this was not a battle for survival. It was a battle for your soul. You would not let them take it without a fight. The Cathar did not respond with a fleet of their own. They did not fire a single missile. They did not seem to notice your brave little ships. Instead, one of their silent mountains shifted. A single point of light appeared on its underside. It was a small, almost gentle light. It grew slowly, from a pinprick to a beam. The beam reached down from the sky. It did not strike a military target. It did not hit a capital city. It touched the center of a vast, empty desert on the far side of the world. For a moment, nothing happened. The light just rested on the sand. Then the world turned white, every sensor on the planet overloaded. When your vision returned, you looked at the satellite feeds. The desert was gone. The entire continent it occupied was gone. In its place was a sea of glowing, molten glass. The landmass had been turned into a smooth, shining scar. It cooled slowly, cracking into 1 billion pieces, a monument to their terrible power. They had not attacked you. They had erased you. They had swatted a fly with a hammer the size of a planet. Your fleet, still waiting for a glorious battle, hung uselessly in the sky. Their weapons were toys. Their courage was meaningless. The Cathar had shown you the difference between a warrior and a god. You were a bug. They were the boot. And they were tired of waiting. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket on the world. Your leaders were silent. Your armies were useless. Your defiance had bought you nothing but a glassed continent. The Cathar gave you a new deadline. 1 hour. Submit, or the next beam would strike the most populated city on Earth. There was nothing left to do, nothing but wait for the end. But you had one last, desperate plan. It was a fool's hope. A message in a bottle thrown into a cosmic ocean. It was a plan born from dusty archives and forgotten legends. There was an old probe, a relic from the early days of your space program. It was named Voyager's Ghost. It was a tiny thing, floating far out in the cold, beyond the orbit of your farthest planet. Its mission had ended decades ago. It was just a piece of drifting junk. But it still had a tiny bit of power, and it still had its transmitter. The plan was insane. Aim the probe's dish not at Earth, but at a distant, fabled star. A star mentioned in texts so old they were almost myths. A place your star science called a gravitational anomaly. The legends called it something else. The throne of the elders. Your engineers worked with frantic energy. They sent a tight beam signal to the old probe, a string of code to change its target, to focus all its remaining power into one final broadcast. It was not a message of words. It was a message of pure mathematics, a sequence that described a violation of natural law, a description of the Cathar's impossible power source, a cry for help written in the language of physics itself. The signal went out, a tiny whisper from a dying probe. It shot out into the deep black, towards a star no one had ever really believed in. It was your last breath, a final, improbable prayer sent to an unknown God. Most of you didn't think it would work. But it was better than doing nothing. It was better than dying on your knees. Far away, in a place where space and time are suggestions, the message arrived. It was not heard by ears or seen by eyes. It was felt, a ripple in the calm sea of existence, a disturbance in a slumber that had lasted for eons. On a world that was not a world, something ancient began to stir. Beings that had watched galaxies be born, beings that remembered the first light of creation. They were not made of flesh and bone. They were woven from the fabric of the universe itself. Gravity was their blood. Starlight was their breath. They had slept through the rise and fall of countless empires. Your little scream of mathematics was a buzzing insect. But it was an insect with a very interesting sting. The math you sent was not just a cry for help. It described a power source that broke the rules, a technology that tore holes in reality for energy. This was a crime against existence itself, a cancer that could not be allowed to spread. The sleeping giants were not waking out of kindness. They were waking out of necessity. They were the universe's immune system, and they had just detected a disease. One of them unfolded. It was not a ship taking flight. It was a thought taking form, a piece of the star-born dark given will and purpose. It looked at the origin of the signal. It saw your small blue world. It saw the silent black mountains hanging in your sky. And it saw the ugly wound of your glassed continent. The elders did not feel anger. They did not feel pity. They felt a cold, deep sense of duty. The balance had been broken. It was their job to restore it. The arrival of the true fleet was nothing like the Cathars. The invaders had come in silence. The newcomers arrived with a roar that tore through the solar system. Space itself seemed to scream. A hole of impossible colors ripped open near Jupiter. It was not a warp gate. It was a wound in reality. From this wound, their ships emerged. They were not ships of metal and light. They looked like creatures born from a black hole's dream. Their hulls were shifting fractals of darkness. They seemed to drink the light of the sun. There were only 3 of them, but their presence was heavier than the entire Cathar fleet. Your sensors didn't just overload. They broke. The sheer physics of their existence was too much to measure. On the command deck of the Cathar mothership, panic erupted. The arrogant conquerors, who had faced your fleet with boredom, were now screaming. Their displays flickered with warnings they had never seen before. Causal violation detected. Space-time integrity failure. Their commander stared at the main view screen. He saw the three impossible ships. He saw the symbols on their hulls. The symbols were not a language. They were a warning. Ancient sigils that burned with a cold, terrifying light. Every Cathar knew them. They were part of their oldest horror stories. The tales they told their young to scare them into obedience. Stories of the Sentinels, the Reapers, the ones who enforced the old laws. The Cathar had thought they were just myths. Bedtime stories to keep them from growing too powerful. A primal fear, buried for 1,000 generations, surfaced. The Cathar commander felt his limbs grow cold. He had seen the power to turn a world to glass. He was now looking at the power that created the glass. They had not just kicked an anthill. They had summoned a god. A very, very angry god. "All ships," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Fire everything." The battle for your solar system was not a battle at all. It was an execution. It was fought in the crimson skies above Mars. The entire Cathar fleet, hundreds of dark mountains, turned their weapons on the three newcomers. Beams of energy that could crack planets shot across the void. Swarms of intelligent missiles blotted out the stars. It was a display of firepower that should have sterilized the system. The ancient ships did not even raise their shields. The beams of light simply stopped. They vanished a few feet from their fractal hulls. The missiles turned around and flew back towards the Cathar ships, detonating against the shields they were designed to bypass. The invaders' greatest weapons were turned into toys. It was like watching a child throw rocks at a tidal wave. Then, one of the ancient ships responded. It did not fire a laser or launch a missile. It simply sang. A low, resonant note that vibrated through the fabric of space. The nearest Cathar ship shuddered. The black metal of its hull began to distort. It twisted and warped like melting plastic. The perfect geometric shape folded in on itself. Then it dissolved into a cloud of dust and shimmering particles. No explosion, no fire. Just gone. The second ancient ship moved. It did not accelerate. It was simply in one place and then another. It moved through the Cathar formation, passing through their ships as if they were ghosts. Every ship it touched fell silent. Their lights went out. Their engines died. They became cold, dead husks adrift in space. The third ship did nothing. It just watched. Its very presence was a weapon. The Cathar fleet was not being fought. It was being dismantled. The once proud Cathar Imperium was broken. Their fleet was in ruins. Their superweapons were useless. The survivors, maybe a dozen ships out of hundreds, huddled together. Their engines were cold. Their weapons were silent. They were beaten. Not just beaten. They were humiliated. The commander of the Cathar flagship stared at his screen. He saw the cold, silent judgment of the ancient ships. His arrogance was gone. His pride was a forgotten memory. All that was left was a raw, animal terror. He did the only thing he could. He opened a channel. Not to the ancient ships. He knew they would not listen. He opened a channel to you. To the small blue world he had tried to conquer. His final transmission was broadcast across your entire planet. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was a plea. "We surrender." His voice crackled. It was thin and reedy. All the booming authority was gone. We did not know. We did not understand. He was babbling. The mighty conqueror was reduced to a frightened child. "We will leave. We will never return. We ask only for mercy." You listened to his voice. You saw the terror on his face. This was the same being who had glassed a continent without a second thought. This was the monster who had given you 1 hour to submit to slavery. Now he was on his knees, begging you, the insects, to spare his life. They asked for mercy, after showing you none. The irony was so thick you could taste it. The three ancient ships stopped their assault. They hung in the void, silent and patient. The remnants of the Cathar fleet floated before them, helpless. Then, one of the ancient vessels turned its attention to you. A message was sent, not with words, but with pure thought. It bypassed all your technology. It appeared directly in the mind of every human on the planet. The message was not a question of strategy. It was a question of morality. They have broken the first law. They have harmed a nascent world. Their existence is a threat to cosmic stability. We are the hand of judgment, but you are the victims. The choice of sentence is yours. What should be done with these prisoners? The universe held its breath. The ancient ones, beings of unimaginable power, had turned to you. They had made you the judge, jury, and executioner. You looked at the Cathar commander's face on your screens. You saw him begging for a mercy he never gave. You held the fate of an entire species in your hands. A species that had, just hours before, held your fate in theirs. You remembered? You remembered the silent mountains in your sky. You remembered the arrogance of their demand. You remembered the brave pilots who flew to their certain deaths. Most of all, you remembered the continent of glass, the shining, sterile scar on your world, a wound that would never fully heal. You remembered the millions of lives that could have been extinguished. All your leaders, all your people. They all came to the same conclusion. There was no debate. There was no discussion. The choice was clear. The answer was broadcast across all channels. Back to the ancient ones. Back to the terrified Cathar. But you sent no words. You sent no sound at all. Your answer was silence. A cold, hard, absolute silence. A silence that said everything you needed to say. It said you remembered their cruelty. It said you would not grant a mercy you were never offered. It said their fate was sealed. The silence was your verdict. It was your judgment. And it was colder than the void between stars. The ancient ones understood. Your silence was more powerful than any speech. It was the reply of a species that had been pushed too far. The reply of a species that had learned a hard lesson. The lead ancient ship seemed to nod. A slow, deliberate gesture that resonated in your mind. The sentence had been passed. The judgment was delivered. It turned its attention back to the Cathar. There was no final blast of energy. There was no grand explosion. The ancient ship simply erased them. The remaining dozen Cathar vessels, including the flagship, just vanished. One moment they were there. The next, there was nothing but empty space. No debris. No radiation. No sign they had ever existed. They were deleted from reality. A footnote in a history book you had not yet written. The ancient ships lingered for a moment. They seemed to look at your world, not with warmth, but with a deep, unsettling understanding. They had given you a great and terrible power, and you had used it. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they were gone. The wound in space near Jupiter healed itself. The solar system was quiet once more. You were left alone. Your sky was clear again. The sun shone on a world that was both saved and damned. You were the masters of your own home once more. But you carried a heavy new burden. The knowledge that you were not alone was no longer a comforting thought. The universe was a dark forest, and it was full of monsters far older and more powerful than the Cathar. You had survived your first test. You had faced extinction and chosen defiance. You had been handed the sword of a god and used it without flinching. You began to rebuild your shattered world. But you were not the same. You were no longer innocent children looking at the stars with wonder. You were survivors. You were judges. You now knew the true laws of the dark. And you knew that mercy was a luxury you might never be able to afford again. The heavy crown of survival was now yours to wear.